Hello, and thanks for tuning into this video. My name is Richard, and I run a company called Muddy York Walking Tours. I offer many different historical presentations and walking tours of Toronto. I put together a presentation called Tales of Christmas Past for the Christmas 2022 season. As you'll see, it explores the history of some of the Christmas traditions that became popular in Toronto and throughout Canada in the 1800s. I've made the presentation available here on YouTube so it can be enjoyed by a broad audience. I usually charge for my presentations and walking tours, but I don't currently have any subscription fees for anything that I post on my YouTube channel, so you're welcome just to watch and enjoy. Having said that, donations are welcome, but not necessary. If you'd like to make a donation, you can email me at richard@muddyyorktours.com to make arrangements. If you enjoy this presentation, please let your friends know about me. Anyone can contact me through my website at www.muddyyorktours.com. You can also find the Muddy York Walking Tour group on Facebook, or look me up on Instagram for lots more about Toronto's history. All my contact information is listed in the video description below. For now, though, please sit back and enjoy my presentation entitled Tales of Christmas Past. Thanks for tuning into this presentation on Tales of Christmas Past. Most of the history that I've included in my talk looks back at how Christmas was celebrated here in Toronto from the last couple of years of the 1700s through to the end of the 1800s. A lot of the traditions that we celebrate in Toronto now in the 21st century haven't been widely accepted for nearly so long as we might imagine. They might seem really old, but a lot of them only started becoming popular at about the same time that Toronto became a city in 1834. That's why I've decided to focus on Christmas traditions from the 1800s. This talk lasts for about 45 minutes. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the comments section for this video, but I'm going to try to anticipate a couple of questions that you might have right at the start so I can get these out of the way. There are a couple of Christmas traditions that I get asked about a lot, but won't be going into a lot of detail about during this presentation. A lot of us have fond memories of the Christmas window displays at big department stores like Simpson's or Eaton's. The first big Christmas store window displays were put up at Macy's department store in New York City in 1883. This trend eventually came to Canadian stores a couple of years later. But although department store Christmas windows started in the last couple of years of the 1800s, they didn't really become a big deal until the 1900s. Now, I know this is a favorite subject for a lot of people, and it's full of Christmas time memories. But since I'll already be discussing about 100 years worth of Christmas history all through the 1800s, I hope that you'll forgive me for leaving out the window displays that became popular through the 1900s. I've used similar logic for leaving out the history of the Toronto Santa Claus Parade. Eaton's department store started the parade in 1905, and it ran it up until 1982. It was then sponsored by other companies, and the Toronto Santa Claus Parade is still going strong today. I do have a whole other presentation on the history of Eaton's and the Santa Claus Parade, but since it started in 1905 and not back in the 1800s, I've considered it a more modern tradition and haven't included it in my presentation today. But don't worry, there are still a lot of Christmas traditions in Old Toronto for us to talk about. This drawing was by a Canadian historical artist named Charles Williams Jeffreys, and it shows us what Christmas in Toronto might have looked like on the day before Christmas in 1853. And this illustration really helped to inspire my talk. I felt like it captures the spirit of what a lot of us might imagine when we think of a Christmas in Old Toronto. And in return, I've tried to put together a lot of the history of how Christmases like this one came to be, from the 1790s, when Christmas wasn't really celebrated very much like it is now, to the end of the 1800s, when most of the traditions that we know and love today had become popular. Let's get started by looking a long way into the past. Now, as I'm sure just about everybody knows, Christmas owes its origins to the Christian nativity story. We all know the basics, from Mary and Joseph's journey to Bethlehem, to the lack of room at the inn, and the humble yet miraculous birth of Christ in the manger, to angels announcing his birth to the shepherds, the adoration of the wise men, and the murderous anger of King Herod. All of these have become part of the traditional Christmas story. They've been recounted in books, plays, and movies, portrayed on Christmas cards, and sung about in carols and songs. And yet, the first documented celebrations of Christmas didn't take place for more than 300 years after Jesus is said to have been born. These first celebrations took place in Rome in the year 336 AD and were recorded in a calendar or almanac that was drawn up for a Roman aristocrat named Voluculus. In fact, of all the holidays that are celebrated by the Christian Church, Easter, Lent, All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day, Corpus Christi, Pentecost, Advent, and Christmas, it was Christmas that was the last to be introduced into the annual Christian calendar. By the Middle Ages, Christmas started to include ivy, holly, and other evergreens. Gifts were usually exchanged between people who had a legal relationship, like tenants and landlords. Christmas traditions like eating, drinking, dancing, and singing grew more popular at this time too, at least in England, which is where a lot of our early Canadian Christmas traditions eventually came from. By the 1600s, Christmas featured lavish dinners and elaborate pageants. In 1607, the English King James I insisted that a play be acted out every year on Christmas night and that everyone at court should play games together. Authors began penning Christmas poems, which were later turned into early Christmas carols. But then came the English Civil War and the religious Christian Puritans, led by Oliver Cromwell. They seized the country and its churches. They considered Christmas to be sacrilegious and obscene, so they outlawed the whole thing in 1647. Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans had a pretty harsh view of parties in general, especially if they weren't written down in the Bible. And although the Nativity story comes from the scriptures, of course, there aren't any biblical passages that I'm aware of where Jesus celebrated his own birthday. So Christmas had to go while Cromwell was in charge. Public notices like this one were put up warning people, and I quote, that since the observation of Christmas has been deemed a sacrilege, the exchanging of gifts and greetings, dressing in fine clothing, feasting, and similar satanical practices are hereby forbidden. People faced fines and even jail time if they celebrated Christmas. But people fought back. Pro-Christmas protesters rioted in the streets of several English cities. They put up makeshift illegal Christmas celebrations, nailed holly to the doors of public buildings, and sang out pro-royalist and pro-Christmas slogans. Oliver Cromwell, that original Grinch who stole Christmas, was eventually overthrown, and the monarchy was restored in 1660. Things lightened up in England when King Charles II reintroduced Christmas, although many fundamentalist Christian clergymen still disapproved of Christmas. Incidentally, this bit of history brings us to an interesting observation. The whole debate about celebrating Christmas and whether it's culturally offensive or not, and whether Christmas trees should be put up at places like Toronto's City Hall or at Ontario's Legislative Assembly building down at Queen's Park, well, this is not a new debate. For hundreds of years now, some people have tried to cancel Christmas, while others have fought to celebrate it. But I don't want to open up a whole debate on 21st century cancel culture and the war on Christmas, and I can only hope that if you've tuned into my presentation this evening, you're not directly opposed to the idea of me actually giving a talk on the history of Christmas in Toronto. So let's get back to some history. Those Puritans I mentioned who canceled Christmas in England started coming over to North America in 1630. They carried their strict and flexible beliefs with them when they boarded their ships to cross the Atlantic. They weren't the first or the only European colonists to come here, but I've singled them out because they transplanted their religious fervor to North American shores. When the Puritans arrived in New England, they still believed that celebrating Christmas was just as sacrilegious as it had been back in Old England. This painting shows one of the early Puritan governors of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts breaking up a Christmas celebration. By 1659, the Pilgrims passed a law canceling Christmas. It was once again illegal to sing Christmas songs, eat a big dinner, or even take Christmas Day off work. Christmas remained unpopular in some parts of the American colonies during and after the American Revolution in the 1770s and early 1780s. But this unpopularity had just as much to do with politics as it did with religion. The American revolutionaries saw the celebration of Christmas as an English custom, and since they hated just about everything about the English, Christmas fell out of fashion. But not everybody who lived in the rebellious American colonies wanted to stay there. In the late 1770s and early 1780s, there were tens of thousands of people who left America and came up to the Canadian colonies. These political refugees were known as the United Empire Loyalists. About 33,000 Loyalists came to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and about 2,000 went to Prince Edward Island. But about 10,000 Loyalists came to what is now Ontario and Quebec. These Loyalists wanted to keep their loyalty to the King, George III, as well as other things like British Parliament, English common law, and all the other English cultural customs that they enjoyed, including the custom of celebrating Christmas. So the British government made all sorts of concessions for these Loyalists. They even made up a whole new province for them called Upper Canada. This new province was officially created by an act of Parliament on December the 26th, Boxing Day of 1791, and the province covered most of modern-day southern Ontario. In 1793, a new settlement called the Town of York was established to become the capital of the province of Upper Canada. The Town of York eventually grew into the city of Toronto. The original Town of York was a rough little settlement hewn out of the Upper Canadian wilderness, but it was also a place where those early English settlers could practice the kind of life that they wanted, including, among many other important political and cultural traditions, the custom of celebrating Christmas. Finally, this brings us to the history of Old Toronto, and we can now ask the question of how Christmas would have been celebrated in Old Toronto all the way back at the start of the 1800s. Well, a lot of the Christmas rituals that we have today wouldn't have been celebrated back in the early days of the Town of York. This is because they hadn't really become very popular here yet. Some people might have been inclined to go to church on Christmas Day, except the Town of York didn't have a church when it was set up in 1793. This illustration that I've shown is of the very first St. James Church. When it was built at the corner of King and Church Streets, it became the very first church ever built in the Town of York, but it wasn't built until 1807. But even if people couldn't congregate in a church, getting together was still an important part of celebrating Christmas in the early 1800s. The vast majority of the people who lived in the province of Upper Canada at that time were farmers. They worked hard all year long, sowing and reaping crops and gathering in the harvest every autumn. But during the winter, there was at least a little less work to do. They could gather together in inns or taverns or one another's homes. If they were lucky, there might even be a neighbor who played the fiddle or the pipes. They all knew that they probably had a dark, cold winter ahead, but getting together to sing and dance and enjoy one another's company gave them a little bit of a reprieve. And by the early 1800s, eating was a big way to make merry at Christmas time. People spent several hours at the dinner table. Roast meat and especially roast birds became popular. These included turkeys, geese, and ducks. Cheese and soup were also popular. All of this was made up of several courses, with each course made up of several different dishes that were laid out symmetrically on the table. Following this, an elaborate dessert, or in some cases, several desserts, were brought out to finish off the meal. We do have a local account of what this man, Joseph Wilcox, had for Christmas dinner in the Town of York on Christmas Day in the year 1800. Wilcox was born in Ireland in 1773 and had only arrived in York in March of 1800, about 9 months before he left us with the menu for the very first Christmas dinner he ever ate here in the Town of York. He wrote of starting dinner with soup before moving on to roast beef, boiled pork, turkey, plum pudding, and mince pies. There must have been leftovers, since Wilcox mentions having supper too. Back in 1800, dinner was a meal that was eaten in the afternoon, while supper was a lighter meal that was eaten later in the evening. But how well could the townspeople in York really have dined in those first few early years? Provisions were often scarce. For example, a poor harvest meant that the winter between 1795 and 1796 was particularly bad. John McGill, the military commissariat, who was based out of Fort York, had to pass out military rations to the townspeople just to keep them from starving. So the grand Christmas Day meals that I mentioned, made up of several courses, might have been few and far between in the early days of the town of York. But then again, Christmas was a big enough holiday that people might have splurged and lived beyond their means for just one day. How many of us living today have been guilty of doing the same, just so that we can make Christmas into an extravagant holiday? There was one other Christmas tradition that was still being practiced, at least in England, when the town of York was established in 1793. This was the custom of kissing under the mistletoe. The tradition dictated that a man could kiss any woman he liked if he saw her standing under mistletoe, no matter whether the woman in question was interested in being a part of this tradition or not. What's more is that it was said that bad luck would befall any woman who refused. Now, I have no idea who the first person was to come up with this tradition, but I'm willing to guess that it was probably invented by a man. This is an illustration called A Kiss Under the Mistletoe, and it was published in 1794. To be honest, I found the illustration a little bit creepy, both because of the way the characters in the illustration are represented and drawn, but also because of what the inscription at the bottom insinuates. It reads, "Bridget the cook on Christmas Day, when all was mirth and jollity, was rudely kissed by saucy Joe, and that beneath the mistletoe. But she returned it with the ladle, and laid about when he was addle, for maids are not to be thus taken, and all their virgin honor shaken." The tradition of kissing under the mistletoe seems to be fading a little bit these days, which maybe might be for the best. But here's one more illustration showing a sailor trying to make merry with a maid underneath the mistletoe. Hundreds of years ago, mistletoe was linked to ancient Druid traditions concerning fertility. In the 1790s, there was an aura of wickedness or even danger in kissing underneath the mistletoe. It could lead to immorality, promiscuous behavior, or even potentially marriage. Now, I'd like to skip ahead a couple of years. This painting shows people skating and sleighing on the ice down near the foot of Parliament Street to celebrate that Toronto officially became a city on March the 6th, 1834. Although this took place in early spring, these were the kinds of things that people might have done to keep active all winter, including at Christmas time. But a lot of things that we associate with Christmas now in the early 21st century just started getting trendy when Toronto became a city in 1834. The dates line up pretty neatly. We can almost imagine that people who lived in the new city of Toronto in 1834 were reinventing a new way to celebrate the Christmas holiday. For starters, this was when Christmas actually started to become a holiday, at least in some places. Christmas Day became a bank holiday in the United Kingdom in 1834, the same year that Toronto became a city. This meant that all the factories and mills and offices in the United Kingdom closed on December the 25th. Boxing Day was added in 1871. But it took a while longer for Christmas to be made an official holiday off work here in Canada. This is William Lyon Mackenzie. He was the very first mayor of Toronto when it became a city in 1834, and 3 years later, he led a rebellion against the provincial government in December of 1837. But Mackenzie was also a liberal journalist. The editorials that he wrote often called for more social equality through great reforms to government, religion, and education. It turns out that Mackenzie had conceptual problems with giving his own staff a day off work for Christmas Day, though. He once docked one of his young teenage apprentices 66 cents for being absent from work on both Christmas Day and New Year's Day. Other ways of celebrating Christmas started to become more popular in the 1830s too. In 1833, a publisher named William Sandys produced a hymnal called Christmas Carols Ancient and Modern. This was the very first time that seasonal songs like God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, The First Noel, I Saw Three Ships, and Hark the Herald Angels Sing appeared in print, and we still sing all of these today. More Christmas carols were written in the second half of the 1800s during the Victorian era, and many of these told variations of the Christian nativity story, including We Three Kings of Orient Are from 1857, Angels We Have Heard on High from 1862, O Little Town of Bethlehem from 1868, and Away in a Manger from 1887. These days, the thought of older Christmas music probably conjures up images of Victorian carolers shuffling through the snow to serenade their neighborhood. This was certainly one of the only ways that a lot of people heard Christmas music in the 1800s, at least until phonograph recordings started to appear by the end of the 1870s. But if there didn't happen to be any carolers strolling through your neighborhood, you could probably find some Christmas music sung in church, and there was always sheet music too, and you could just try singing carols at home with your family and friends. Next, we come to a Victorian Christmas tradition that might be a little bit endangered these days, thanks to 21st century technology and progress. This is the world's first adhesive postage stamp ever invented. It went on sale in the United Kingdom in May of 1840. For the first time, anyone could send mail throughout the United Kingdom for the cost of a penny. These days, one single penny black stamp in mint condition can fetch upwards of $3,000 at auction. Incidentally, the first Canadian stamp was the three-penny beaver, and it was designed by Sir Sandford Fleming, and it depicts a beaver in an oval frame. This was the first official postage stamp anywhere in the world to depict an animal instead of a king or a queen. The province of Canada issued the three-penny beaver in 1851, and only 250,000 were ever issued. The auction value for one of these stamps can reach up to about $60,000 if it's in excellent condition. But once the penny black stamp was issued in the United Kingdom, the race was on to see which entrepreneur would capitalize off this at Christmas time. A man named Sir Henry Cole took advantage of the new postal system when he invented the first Christmas card in 1843. This is an image of that very first Christmas card. It shows a group of people gathered together for a Christmas meal. The caption at the bottom reads, "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you." The card caused a bit of a stir back in 1843 because it shows a young girl being given a drink of wine at the dinner table. Just over 2,000 of these cards were produced in 1843, but only about 21 of them still survive today. They can be worth thousands of dollars to collectors. Some older Christmas cards from the 1800s show us how publishers hadn't really embraced all the nativity scenes and pictures of Santa Claus that some of us might think of as traditional today. This is a Christmas card from the Toronto Public Library Archives ephemera collection. It's from about 1880, and it shows a young girl with a simple message to wish you a Merry Christmas. Here are a couple more from the Toronto Library Archives. The one on the left is from 1875 and shows two children who are playing with a goat for some reason. The one on the right is from the 1880s and shows a woman feeding the birds. So once again, maybe not the kind of imagery that we might expect to see on an old-fashioned Christmas card these days. But birds and other animals were popular themes on Christmas cards in the last couple of decades of the 1800s. This is a card that was published in 1880 by the J. Blizzard and Company toy store at 49 King Street West, right here in Toronto. The message says, "A right Merry Christmas." But instead of showing an image of children playing with toys, for example, which might be expected, it shows two birds on a bare tree branch. Here's another Christmas card from the same company that was also printed in 1880. Now, this one reads, "A Merry Christmas to you and yours," but for some reason that was lost on me, it shows the image of a swimming seagull. Here is yet another card from the Toronto Library Archives. It's from 1882. Now, I would definitely put it into the bizarre category. The greeting at the bottom reads, "In silvery accents, whispering low, a happy Christmastide." Meanwhile, a man looks out from his window while four cats have gathered on his rooftop to serenade him. If anyone ever made a modern Toronto version of this card today, it would probably involve raccoons. Some of the old Victorian Christmas cards that I found from other countries were even stranger than anything I saw in the Toronto Library archives. Here's one from the Nova Scotia archives that reads, "A hearty Christmas greeting. 4 jovial froggies a skating would go. They asked their mama, but she sternly said no. And they all came to grief in a beautiful row. There's a sweet Christmas moral for one not too slow. Just go." Now, I'm not really sure what the lesson is here, other than, I don't know, maybe even frogs should always listen to their parents, I suppose. Here's another one, this time from the New York Public Library. It shows a rooster and a duck fighting it out with a turtle. The inscription reads, "A hearty Christmas to you all. May good digestion wait on appetite." Illustrations like these demonstrate how Christmas card designs were made to serve as conversation starters as much as they were meant to celebrate the Christmas season. There's one more bizarre animal-themed Christmas card that I'll include. This one was printed in the 1880s, and it shows a mouse riding a lobster. The mouse is carrying a note that translates from the French as peace, joy, health, and happiness. Now, there's one more local vintage Christmas card that might restore us all to more of a normal Christmas spirit. The card that I've shown here was put out by Canada's Post Office Department in December of 1885. At the top left, we see a woman posting a Christmas card in a mailbox, and then at right, a uniformed mail carrier is delivering cards from door to door. The inscription reads, "Toronto's post office employees, annual greetings to their friends everywhere. Compliments of the season." Let's get back to some more traditional Christmas customs. Back in the 1840s, a man named Thomas Smith found that candy sales in a shop in London, England, were in a bit of a slump. So in 1847, he invented the Christmas cracker to help boost sales. At first, he just inserted humorous mottos and funny slogans in the candy wrappers. He was inspired to put the crack into the Christmas crackers when he heard the crackle of a log that he had just put on the fire. The paper wrapper around the cracker had to be increased to incorporate the banger mechanism, and eventually the candy was left out and replaced by a small gift instead. The other elements that we find in the modern Christmas cracker, the gifts, the paper hats, and the various designs, were added later by Tom Smith's son, Walter Smith. This was his way of differentiating his original product from all the counterfeit copycat products that other retailers were soon trying to sell. That brings us to one of the most iconic symbols of Christmas. Christmas trees started appearing hundreds of years ago in Germany and a few other European countries. There were a lot of different theories about why people in these countries started bringing trees inside and putting them up in their homes. One really popular theory is that Christmas trees originated back before Christianity was the dominant religion in Germany. Before that, people celebrated a holiday called Yule. This winter holiday was based on old Scandinavian or Viking celebrations. As Christianity spread through Europe, people still held on to some of their old traditions. The Christmas tree became more and more popular throughout Germany by about the middle of the 1500s. But it didn't start becoming popular anywhere else until Germans started traveling around the world and taking their Christmas tree traditions with them. Earlier in my presentation, I mentioned how a group of refugees called Loyalists escaped to the Canadian colonies during the American Revolution. Any Loyalists who were culturally British brought their own Christmas traditions up here with them, but not all of the Loyalists were from a British background. There were about 30,000 German mercenaries who fought for the British during the American Revolution. These mercenaries were known for their military discipline and skill, but they also brought some of the other cultural traditions with them to remind them of home far away on the other side of the Atlantic. This is a portrait of a German baron and military officer named Friedrich Adolf Riedesel. He commanded a group of German mercenary soldiers during the American Revolution and was taken prisoner by the Americans in New York in 1777. He was finally released 3 years later and returned to his family, who were living in the village of Sorel in Quebec. This is the Baron's wife, Frederica Charlotte Riedesel. When her husband came back to Quebec after his captivity, she threw him a big party on Christmas Eve, 1781. The couple also invited several British and German military officers. All their guests marveled at the balsam fir tree that had been cut down and placed in the center of the room. This is a painting of the Christmas party that the Riedesels threw in 1781. The artist's name is undocumented, but the painting still hangs in a museum in Sorel, Quebec. We can see how most of the guests have their attention turned towards the Christmas tree that's being put up quite prominently in the middle of the room. The Christmas tree was decorated with fruit and nuts and lit with white candles. It's the first Christmas tree known to have been put up anywhere in North America. Canada Post even issued this stamp on the right in 1981 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of when the Riedesels brought the Christmas tree to the Canadian colonies. But even though this record was set all the way back in 1781, the Christmas tree remained relatively obscure in Canada for several decades. It didn't really become popular until one particularly famous couple put one up in their home and finally made the Christmas tree almost universally popular. This is Queen Victoria, an historical figure who probably doesn't need much of an introduction. Suffice to say that by the end of the 1800s, she ruled over an empire that governed nearly 1/4 of the world's population. This empire brought British traditions, including Christmas traditions, to all four corners of the globe. A lot of the images of Queen Victoria that we see today look like the one on the left. They show her as a somewhat dour-looking older woman. But Queen Victoria was a rosy-cheeked and love-struck 20-year-old when she got married on February the 10th, 1840. She'd been queen for less than 3 years, and her new husband, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was the great love of her life. He'd relocated from Germany to marry her, and in return, she would do anything for him. This included letting him put up a Christmas tree in Windsor Castle, one year when he was feeling particularly homesick for some of the Christmas traditions that he'd known back in Germany. This illustration appeared in a British magazine called the London Illustrated News in 1848. Queen Victoria is at left in the soft red or pink dress. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, stands behind her. Prince Albert is the man standing on the far right, and 6 of their children are standing around the royal family Christmas tree at Windsor Castle. A lot of people saw that image of the royal family and their Christmas tree when it appeared in the London Illustrated News in 1848. The magazine covered a lot of popular news stories. It had a lot of illustrations, and a lot of people read it to get ideas about what was cool and trendy. So in a way, maybe we can compare the London Illustrated News to some sort of Victorian print version of Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok, all rolled into one. Meanwhile, Canada was still a collection of British colonies in 1848 when that picture of the Christmas tree at Windsor Castle was published. Many people who lived here wanted to emulate Queen Victoria and her royal family, though. Maybe they wanted to feel patriotic, or maybe they just felt the same instincts that some of us do today that compel us to copy whatever celebrities do. 2 years after that English engraving of 1848, a slightly modified version of the same picture appeared in a women's magazine in the United States. The picture was altered to show the American president and his family. Prince Albert became President Fillmore, and the Queen became his wife, Abigail. The Fillmores only had 2 children, so obviously some artistic license was taken, but the idea of a Christmas tree caught on in America, too. This time, the idea of having a Christmas tree really caught on across North America, and the tradition stuck. We do things a little bit differently now. Most people use mass-produced ornaments and feel a lot safer with electric Christmas lights than they do with live fire-burning candles. But we can trace modern-day Christmas trees back about 175 years to the social and cultural influences inspired by Queen Victoria and her family. As Victorians embraced all the Christmas traditions that became more popular in the second half of the 1800s, the holiday captured the imagination of a new generation of storytellers. Charles Dickens published A Christmas Carol on December the 19th, 1843. Nearly 100 years later, the work remains the second most popular Christmas story of all time after the Nativity. The story is familiar to most of us. Miserly old Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by a series of specters on Christmas Eve. They convince him to change his ways, and he is ultimately transformed into a great and generous benefactor. The work also tackles the social concerns that Victorians were becoming increasingly aware of. This is a colorized photograph from the late 1800s showing poor children on the streets of Liverpool in England. A Christmas Carol drew attention to the problems of poverty and a lack of education, especially amongst children like these ones. Maybe when we read A Christmas Carol, we might be tempted to think of all the poverty that Dickens writes about as something that only happened in England about 150 years ago. But this photograph from the early 1900s shows a group of poor children who lived in a Toronto neighborhood called St. John's Ward. Sadly, Toronto has never been immune to childhood poverty. Charles Dickens obviously had an effect on people when he wrote about ignorance and want in A Christmas Carol. In the spring of 1844, a few months after the work was published, reports attributed to the sudden burst in charitable giving to Dickens' novella. The story also had an important impact on how Christmas was celebrated. Some people have gone on to credit Charles Dickens and his story of A Christmas Carol of 1843 with reviving or inspiring many of the Christmas traditions that I've discussed during my presentation. This was true in England, but his work also inspired overseas readers in places like Toronto, too. And Charles Dickens did visit Toronto. He was only here for a couple of days from May the 4th to May the 6th of 1842. Toronto had a population of about 30,000 people at the time. He stayed here at the American Hotel, which used to be at the corner of Front and Yonge Streets. It was a year and a half before Dickens published A Christmas Carol, but he did have some observations on early Victorian Toronto and its people. He wrote of how the town itself is full of life and motion, bustle, business, and improvement. The streets are well paved and lighted with gas. The houses are large and good, the shops excellent. Many of them have a display of goods in their windows, such as may be seen in thriving county towns in England, and there are some which would do no discredit to the metropolis of London itself. But Dickens' positive impressions of Toronto were balanced by what he felt when he had dinner with the Lieutenant Governor, Sir John Beverley Robinson. Robinson was a die-hard conservative, even by the standards of 1842. Some of this might have been apparent to Charles Dickens, who said, "The wild and rabid Toryism of Toronto is seriously appalling." Literary historians have often credited Dickens' visit to Toronto as an inspiration for his writing of A Christmas Carol. But did our rabid Tories like Sir John Beverley Robinson, the Lieutenant Governor, actually inspire the character of Ebenezer Scrooge? Or could Dickens have passed by some poor, wretched Toronto family and been motivated to create Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim? The truth is, we'll probably never know. Now, there's one final Christmas icon who's been conspicuously absent from my talk so far. It's generally accepted that Santa Claus was inspired by a Christian figure named St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas traveled through the Mediterranean and Middle East and died in a town in southwest Turkey sometime between the years 345 and 350 AD, so just over 1650 years ago now. St. Nicholas became known for charity and especially for giving gifts to children on his feast day, which is December the 6th. St. Nicholas's Day is a popular celebration in countries like Germany, Switzerland, or Holland, One traditional custom was to put gifts of nuts, apples, and sweets in the shoes of children left beside their beds or on windowsills or at the hearth. Throughout the 1800s, St. Nicholas grew from a saintly Christian character into the jolly old elf that we know today. Some of these changes come from German or Scandinavian traditions. Thor, the Scandinavian god of war, had a flying chariot drawn by goats, and maybe this was the inspiration for why Santa uses reindeers to pull the sleigh these days. The traditions that describe Santa getting into homes through the chimney might have come from a Scandinavian or German tradition of preparing altars or fires so that certain Norse deities could descend through the flames to bring everybody good fortune. The famous Santa-themed poem, The Night Before Christmas, actually predates a few of the other traditions that I've talked about in my presentation so far. The poem was first published in 1823. Although authorship is often credited to an American author and professor named Clement Clark Moore, the poem was originally published anonymously, and there's been a lot of speculation about who actually wrote it. Now, I thought I'd wrap up my presentation with a reading of The Night Before Christmas. The illustrations that I've used are by an artist named Jesse Wilcox Smith, who produced them for a publication of the poem from 1912. "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads, and Mamma in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled down for a long winter's nap. When out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from the bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new fallen snow gave the luster of midday to objects below, when what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer. With a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be Saint Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came. He whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donder and Blitzen, to the top of the porch, to the top of the wall. Now dash away, dash away, dash away all. As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky. So up the housetop the coursers they flew, with the sleigh full of toys, and St. Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry. His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard of his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of his pipe was held tight in his teeth, and the smoke, it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk. And laying his finger aside of his nose and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. but I heard him exclaim ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night." That concludes my presentation on Tales of Christmas Past and the seasonal traditions that became popular throughout Toronto in the 1800s. I hope that you've enjoyed it. This concludes my presentation. Don't forget to leave any questions or feedbacks in the video comments. And if you've enjoyed it, please feel free to share it with your friends. Also, just one last reminder that donations are welcome, but not necessary. If you'd like to make a donation, you can email me at richard@Muddy York Tours to make arrangements. There are also links in the video description below that will take you to my website, my Facebook group, and my Instagram account, which is hundreds of photographs of Toronto history. Thanks again for watching.